We finished up yesterday looking at the horoscope of Stephen Gaskin, the man behind Stephen's Farm. We noted that he had the sun in Aquarius and 2 other planets in the 4th house. We're looking at the 4th house as the gateway to opportunities to understand the personal subconscious. Now, Stephen Gaskin didn't use the language of psychology, and he didn't use our kind of language, but he was working with some of the same issues. He was working with unconscious influence that comes from heredity or from family tradition. Now, his approach was a mild form of eugenics and a non-traditional family structure. And he tried to break down too close of family bonds. Now, I don't know how successful he was. I've only met a few of the kids that grew up in that. But I don't know anything about his inner life. And I don't know if he probed his personal unconscious or not. So the presentation and much of his life was about the personal unconsciousness, but it was not in the personal unconscious. And that's a very big difference. And it's very hard to get into the unconscious. And we're going to take a look at people who did get into the personal unconscious or in some way were functional there. Now, the first example that we have to work with, hang on to your hats because this is, we're going to deal with some difficult things today. The first example is extremely difficult to work with astrologically. It's one of those horoscopes, when you look at the horoscope and then you look at the life, it doesn't seem to match the horoscope. Normally that means bad birth data, but the astrological fact checkers and the astrological researchers give it the highest rating for accuracy of data. So it is true data. So this caused me to do a lot of thinking and pondering on the horoscope, and I'm still pondering on it. Now, this is a female horoscope, and I'll give you first some of the facts about her life before we look at the horoscope. She had many, many sexual affairs with both men and with women. She was considered a sensualist and a libertine. And she was a glutton for all emotions. Love, hate, sex, ecstasy, jealousy, any emotion you can think of, she wanted. She lived together for 6 years with France's most notorious lesbian. She participated in various different kinds of menages of all varieties, and she danced nude publicly, both in and out of theaters. She had lovers that were many years older than her and many that were many years younger than her. She's noted for being a writer. She had a regular column in a newspaper. She wrote film scripts. And for most of her life, she wrote 5 letters per day. And she has written 50 books. And there is no argument about it that she is France's greatest female writer. But she's not known much in the United States except among the literati. And so this is the horoscope of the woman known as Colette.
What's her real name?
Oh, I don't know. Almost nobody in the world almost uses her real name. It's if you.
Is that same as Anna Nin?
No. Anais Nin is a very different person. Now, if you look at this is really not the horoscope of a sensualist. But Libra is rising. I should get out a pointer here. Libra is rising, so it is potentially the horoscope of a libertine. This is not the horoscope of someone who is immoral. But with the sun and the moon in Aquarius, it is someone who is amoral. We're talking about one of your favorite writers.
Carol was saying the chair.
Oh, there's no other chair available.
I think that's Elizabeth said she was. There's
Well,
a chair right next to the door.
well, when she comes, we'll do something.
Yeah.
So she was amoral, not immoral. She could do all of these things that she did, and she really wasn't tainted centrally by them. With all of the planets in Aquarius and a prominent Uranus up near the midheaven, she was a freedom lover. And sometimes in the early stages of becoming free, we like to express our freedom. There's a little bit of insecurity. Now, this isn't somebody who was just a social rebel. Uranus is in the 10th house, and I find over the years that people who have Uranus in the 10th house are social misfits, whether they like it or not. And Uranus is square to Mars, so that's a pretty strong rebellious combination. So she is flagrant in her rebellion. So all of these things that we've been talking about were as much a matter of rebellion as anything. Now the sun and the moon together in conjunction have no external aspects. So this is someone who is focused with illumined consciousness into the personal unconscious. She is alert in a murky atmosphere. The image I get is like being lowered into a large cavern with a lamp, and she can discern some of the general features of the cavern with that light. Now she's, like all Aquarians, she's dispassionate, and so she can watch herself and her escapades while she is going through them. So she is sort of a humanist scientist. She's more that than she is a philanderer, even though people would describe it as philandering. The way it works out, and it's very clear from her writings, years ago on the public radio here, there used to be a program called Mainstreams in Modern Literature, and they read her, week by week, they read her entire book called Cherie, which is probably her most famous novel. And she really understands, this is somebody that, she doesn't understand the unconscious the way a psychiatrist would, but she understands it in a practical way. She understands all the machinations that take place in the lower nature. And she knows how to use them if she needs to in her life. And she demonstrates her knowledge in her writing. So this is to say that opportunities for understanding the personal subconscious in the 4th house, one does not have to be a mystic and one doesn't have to be a psychiatrist. All you have to do is understand what goes on in your own lower nature and see how it applies to other people. Now her writing skill is indicated by the Mercury conjoined Saturn that are sextile to Venus. And she's a magnificent writer. The Saturn sextile Mercury shows that she has pinpoint accuracy. And to be a really good writer, you have to be parsimonious about the number of words that you use, which is what she did. The Saturn sextile Venus shows emotional depth and emotional control. And that was, that she was excellent at. And Mercury is sextile to Venus, and that's persuasion. If it's just Mercury alone, it's mental persuasion, and if it's just Venus alone, it's love persuasion. But when you put the two of them together, it is a blending of love and the mental workings, and that is usually the very best for persuasive writing or persuasive speaking or something of that nature. Now, Mercury's in a different sign from the Sun. Mercury's in Capricorn and the Sun is in Aquarius. And usually when Mercury's in a different sign from the Sun, it means that the mind functions differently from the intent of the self. And in this case, the mind is more tough and more controlled and certainly more earthy than the Sun, which would be just merely aloof. So there had to be some disconnection between herself and in her aloofness, and she had to do that in order to survive in the kind of life that she had. Now, her early writings were more salacious and sensationalistic. I think we all do that when we're young. We're out there to prove ourselves to the world, and we make very bold, extravagant statements and things like that. But in her later works, the Saturn part comes in, and her keen observations, especially, she'll talk about the actions of people and tell you what the motivations are. Her most famous work in the United States was in a movie, the movie Gigi. She wrote the book that was taken from. And Cherie is probably her best work of fiction. Cherie is the story of when she was 47, she'd seduced her 17-year-old stepson. And they had a relationship for a number of years, and she fictionalized it, and it was very, very well done. When she looks into people's subconscious and just judges their motivations, she's fair in the Aquarian way. She doesn't judge, she doesn't censure, she has appreciation. Now, part of the reason for her uncanny accuracy in the subconscious is that the Mercury and Saturn are also square to Neptune. And this shows that there's some kind of sensitivity, uncontrolled sensitivity. And Neptune's in the 7th house, so it is her partners with whom she has this amazing sensitivity, and she knows what's going on inside of them. The Saturn square Neptune part gives another potential interpretation as to why all of these things that she put herself into, all of the wild life that she had. And Saturn square Neptune is treated differently in different societies. It is the hallmark of depression. But in France, they don't call it depression, they call it ennui. And their relation to it is not to take drugs, but their relationship to depression is to, let's have a fling, let's have a great time. And that's the way she related to it. Now, she did get interested in some of the things that we as mystical students get into, but she did it through the square, which was not wholesome. She became fascinated with knowing other things that were invisible, and she spent, there was a period of her life that she spent quite a bit of time with a Ouija board, and tried to discern the secrets of the world through the Ouija board. At any rate, she lived a full life, and she died at 81 years old, which is a pretty good age to live to. Now, some of us have, at least from time to time, blue-nosed tendencies. And some people are probably a little uncomfortable about all this talk about sex and lower things. And you say, is this appropriate for a Rosicrucian Fellowship summer school? Well, we're not trying to be sensationalistic. And we're not trying to be tempting or anything like that. We're trying to get at the reality of the lower nature. And we're speaking about it. And when Max Heindel first describes the lower nature, he calls it the animal nature. It was the first sin, the sin of peremptorily using the creative force that precipitated our fall. So under the promptings of the Lucifer spirits, we were carried into extremes of using the sexual force, because the way it works is when we have extreme emotions in sex, in passion, we are in extreme emotions and we are very open, and they can harvest us for energy and for experience and things like that. Uranus and Mars are the planets that most clearly describe the Luciferic temperament. So in the horoscope we just looked at, Mars square Uranus indicates a strong Luciferic influence. And even as impersonal as she was, she probably was under that influence and probably was well harvested. Now, it's not, even though sex plays a large part of it, sex is not the only large element in the lower nature. The second sin, the sin of Cain, violence plays a large part of the lower nature. That's the way it went. Under the first sin, we released sexual energy without knowing when and why to use it harmoniously with its purpose. And so it was sort of like a blast, and our energy went in all directions. And we got into this consciousness of the energy, letting the energy go in wherever we would like it to go. And when that happens and the energy gets stopped up, we egoistic people, we get angry. And so the second sin is the sin of violence. When we don't get our way with that energy that we have been appropriating the use of selfishly for our own enjoyment, that's what happens with it. But this isn't all bad. Max Heindel tells us, when he's talking about the history of religion and the history of consciousness and morality, he says that pain played a large role. He tells us that we needed to become aware of the external world, because one of the effects of jumping the gun with the sexual energy was to plunge us deeper into matter. And so we needed to become aware of the external world. So anything that produced an external sensation was considered good. And so in the Lemurian epoch, when we were in male bodies, we were brought to participate in contests of will and sensation. Terrible things were done. We tortured each other with hot coals and things like that. And we still find that among some primitive societies now. In order to become an adult male, you have to have your will proven, and that usually involves something very, very extreme as an activity. Like in some ceremonies conducted right here in the United States, they peel strips of skin up the arm and across the chest and down the other arm. They peel the skin off. And when you do that, you are then considered a man. You're considered an exemplary man. So that was then. Now we are awake and conscious in the external world, and our values are very different. We are now conscious of the fact that there's the same life that is in us is in everything else, and so we try to live lives where we respect other things. We respect the sanctity of life. However, that doesn't negate the fact that we have a huge backlog of unredeemed destiny from past lives. We have been so commissive in the past that we aren't able to keep up with it in terms of expiation in the present. And so we have a lot of work to do. So we still have among us, we have wars and we have terrorism, and we fight with each other, even our own friends we get angry with. So our personal subconscious, both residual and topical, is filled with unredeemed sex and violence. It's not all there is there, but there's a large amount of it there. So much so that we can't be trusted with spirituality, with a full clairvoyance, because we try to use it to our own advantage, and we carry that even further. Very few people, when they learn to leave their body with full waking consciousness, can get past what is called the dweller on the threshold. And the dweller on the threshold is a composite entity that is made up of the fragments of all of the unredeemed, nasty things that we have done from past lives. And we have to look at that and admit, yes, we have done those things, and then piece by piece we have to redeem them by transforming them through loving acts in helping the whole process of the evolutionary creation going on. Very few people get past that dweller without the help of a powerful teacher to help them. Now, when we say these things, we're not trying to cower us, or we're not trying to strengthen the adversary by saying, oh, the adversary is so strong. We're just trying to say that we need a lot of love. When we deal with situations where there is anger and heavy confrontation, we need a lot of love. All right, let's look at one more horoscope that talks about some of the unredeemed parts of the lower nature. The other part, we looked at the sex part, now let's look at the violence part. That's the horoscope of Marlon Brando. And we again see a very obvious Sun conjoined Moon in the 4th house, only this time it is in Aries. And Aries is an active sign, and it's a martial sign, and it's all about energy and violence. All of the fiery signs, even to some extent Sagittarius, if there's not care taken, there is a tendency to violence. It happens to be a very constructive sign, but not always everyone uses it constructively. Now, the Sun and the Moon are in two major aspect patterns. The Sun and the Moon square Mars, and they square Pluto. Pluto is distantly opposite to Mars, but by the association through the Sun and Moon, they form a T-square. The other pattern is that the Sun and the Moon trine Jupiter, and they trine Neptune in Aries in the 9th house, so you have a grand trine. And usually when you have aspect patterns like that, they represent a cluster of consciousness. And that's what this is. Two clusters that are not greatly different from each other. One is not pleasant, and the other is very pleasant, but both of them are of a fiery nature. So we're talking about someone here who has all of that fire and energy and stuff like that. This is somebody that's dynamic. Even if just sitting there, the person is dynamic. And it's no wonder with that kind of galvanizing energy that he has charisma. Mars often has a lot to do with the generation of charisma, especially if it's aspecting with Neptune. Now, when Marlon Brando was young, he was a roustabout and he was a troublemaker, and he got kicked out of school. And both of his parents were alcoholics, and both of his parents were, what do you call it, adulterers. They had multiple affairs, and they didn't want to deal with it. So they sent him out east to a military academy, and they figured this will shape him up. But in the military academy, he continued to be a troublemaker, and he was anti-authoritarian. You know, you got a lot of energy and you live in your own energy, you feel challenged by any energy, whether it is a new authority or not. And so he was so anti-authoritarian that he got expelled from school. He didn't want to go back home to that, with his parents, and he had nowhere to go, so he went to New York City. And his sister was in acting school, and he hung out with her, and he went to an acting workshop with her, and there was an old grand dame of the theater running this workshop, and she took one look at him and she recognized his strong masculine appeal, and he had erotic appeal, and he had sort of an empathy despite all of his he was a likable person. How can you not be a likable person when you put her in Sagittarius in the first house? Outwardly, he seems a happy, charming type of person. And so she took him under her wing, and he made it big. He was a star on Broadway, and then he started making films. Now, the Jupiter in the first house indicates positivity and idealism, and that gave him instant appeal. But the T-square has an almost brutal quality about it. But that also made him attractive in the same way that a Black Panther or a tiger or something like that, it has an attractive appeal to it. It's a beautiful form of deathliness. And this is the way he lived. He was aware of it, of his masculine appeal, and he was aware of the things that worked inside of him, even the more primitive things, but he was uncomfortable with them. And he didn't always know what to do with it. I read a story about him at one time. He was filming a cowboy film called Missouri Breaks. And they were out on the prairie somewhere, and there was a break in the filming. So a number of the members of the cast walked over to this stream nearby, and he shocked them all by stepping into the stream barefooted. He walked into the stream and he slapped the fish out of the stream just like a bear would do it, and everybody was shocked. But not as shocked as they were when he walked over. The fish was bouncing on the ground, as they tend to do. He picked up the fish and bit into it while it was alive and started eating. This is a strong martial quality, Aries is really a constructive sign, and he tried, as time went on, to live a more constructive life. He was an idealist, but his idealism was not in touch, or in step, I should say, with the culture that we live in. And so he went tried to become a white Indian, is basically what it amounted to, and he, went off in that direction. Now, the Rosicrucian Fellowship had a great astrologer by the name of Elman Bacher. And Elman Bacher pointed to the fact that a lot of actors, because of their service to humanity by inspiring people through their acting roles, that they could step out of their own personality and they could redeem things in their character by taking roles that they could live them out in a psychodrama in the movie roles that they took. And this is a lot of what happened with Marlon Brando. This is a technique that still, to some extent, exists in the world. Like, for example, 2,000 years ago, the Eleusinian Mysteries, they acted out a drama. And in the Mysteries of Isis and Osiris, they also acted out the life of a hero in a drama. This was present up until Freemasonry in our own time, only now the Freemasons no longer act it out. They have professional actors do it and they watch, which means that there's less moral redemption in Freemasonry now as there used to be at another time. So, in doing this, the trine that we have represents how he could work things out of his subconscious and redeem them spiritually. It is a process that is called projection. And all of the fire signs, but especially Sagittarius, are excellent for projection. And so what he did is he projected things from the subconscious and he spiritualized them. Even, primitive people, as in the Streetcar of Desire, he made them into people that were somebody that you could care about. And, Tennessee Williams, it's pretty hard to turn into something, bring idealism to, but he certainly did a great job of that. And so that's what this life is all about. A lot of very primitive tendencies that are difficult to redeem, but that some of them were redeemed through acting them out. All right. This is taking a little too long.
He could have been a contender.
Yeah, I could have been a contender. All right, now it's time to look at the man who coined the term the unconscious, Sigmund Freud. This is the father of psychoanalysis, and we see here the sun is conjoined to Uranus. And the sun conjoined to Uranus is a eureka kind of person. It is a discoverer, and this is what his life was. He was a discoverer. Beyond that, everything is in the 7th house, which we'll talk about a little bit, and most of the planets are in the west altogether. But he has a lot of planets in the 6th house. So he was very patient-oriented, very practice-oriented. He was very dedicated to his patients. He has Saturn sextile Venus in a very strong sextile, and he really loved his patients, and he cared about them. Now, Uranus sun people, or just Uranus people in general, are sometimes preemptive and they jump to conclusions much too quickly, because not all of the impulses that come from within are intuition. Sometimes it's just plain impulsiveness, and Uranus can be either. It can be impulsiveness or it can be intuitiveness. And what happened in his case is this is the man that popularized cocaine for the world. This is before he got deeply into psychoanalysis. He was touting cocaine as a wonder drug, and he continued to do that in Tarian fashion, because Tara stubbornly persists in things until a dear friend of his died as an addict. He learned. He quit the whole business with cocaine. He learned a lot of things. He's a person that thinks about other people. All that stuff in the 7th house, you think about the other. This is a house, on this side you think about the personality, but over here you think about the other. And we'll look at that. 4 planets in Taurus, which is a sign of love. And so he loved people. And his first going into the unconscious, the personal unconscious, was through hypnotism. But he came to the conclusion that this was too brutal, And he didn't even know anything about our Rosicrucian philosophy, about how the will forces the vital body out of the person who's being hypnotized and gets replaced by the suggestive forces in the ethers from the hypnotist. But he recognized that it was not to be done. But he needed to be in touch with the unconscious. Now, Neptune is there, which there are two types of intuition. There's the Uranian intuition that you know that something is true without even knowing why. You just know it's true. The Neptunian kind of intuition knows that something is true, but in some strange way it understands why. And he wanted to understand why people were doing the things they were doing and why they would become hysterical or why they would forget things or things of that nature. And so what he did is he developed a method called free association, in which he would invite the patient to say anything the patient wanted to say. And he would hold the patient in that vein, and he said, well, what does that bring up in you? And the person would say one thing after another, and what would happen is he could intuitively from that understand what was active in the personal subconscious. We're going to talk about that in some of the evening talks, and it's fascinating the things that he could do. And he couldn't see into the unconscious, personal unconscious, but he could intuit it, and he could intuit it by reflection. Now, the aspect is a sextile, and the sextile is a reflective aspect, meaning to say that what he discerns from the free association, from that he can reflectively understand what it means in the, that dark scheming quality in the unconscious. So he could do this while the person was wide awake, and he could be wide awake and come to a full understanding of it. Now, it's later in the week we're going to look at the horoscope of Carl Jung. And both of them were very strong seventh house people. And the seventh house was the way he got into the fourth house. And the seventh house is the other. There's an old folk statement that goes, if you want to know what a man is really like inside, look at his wife. And it's that kind of an understanding that you're focused on the other. Now, when there is a counseling situation between the agent and patient, a bond is set up such that the patient draws things from the subconscious, and positive things and negative things, and transfers them onto the agent, so that the agent is by turns a devil and a salvation to the individual. This is called transference, and the purpose of the therapist, the agent, is to feed back what has been transferred to the agent little by little, so the person can incorporate that into their consciousness. So the seventh house is a house of transference. So we can again see how when he draws things from the personal unconscious, he's willing to take them onto himself in lieu of the other person, and then feed it back to them. Very, very beautiful thing. And he was a very successful therapist. I think both Freud and Jung were incredibly successful in their therapy work, and they excelled there where they didn't do so hot in their theoretical work, at least by comparison. Now, for a while I had a lady friend who has since then, she's retired now, but she's been dean of the School of Social Work in 2 different universities. And when we went out together, she was the lead psychiatric social worker at the local hospital here. And she studied a lot of curious papers. And she told me of a paper that she read where they took what were considered successful therapies and what was common to successful therapies, and it was independent of how they worked or what psychological school of therapy they had, all of those different factors. And when they statistically factored everything out, they found one thing to be consistent in successful therapies. And that one consistent thing in successful therapy was that the therapy was more likely to be successful if the therapist liked the patient.
Yeah, right.
And Sigmund Freud loved his patients, and he cared for them. And it's a really good statement about it. Now, this is a little bit off topic, but what is really important about this is that he not only probed other people's subconscious, he probed his own. He spent several hours daily. He didn't do retrospection, but he did something similar to it. Meaning to say, he was always analyzing his own life and how well he did. And that's a wonderful thing. All right, in his life, in his horoscope, the Neptune is not only involved in the sextile, the Neptune is also square to the Moon. And Moon-Neptune afflictions are usually or often superstitions. And a superstition is a substitution phenomenon. Sometimes we substitute a feeling when we should have a thought. Or sometimes we substitute a thought for a feeling. And it results in a superstitious outlook on things. Now, Freud, like many Taurus people in the 19th century, was a materialist. And he was a self-described atheistic materialist. As with many materialists, there is a disdain for occultism. He was afraid that psychoanalysis was going to be taken as some form of occultism. But the funny thing is, he had this draw toward it with the Moon square Neptune. He was drawn to it, and he had personal feelings about the occult things. And in his case, because the Moon is in the 8th house, and Saturn is also in the 8th house, and Saturn is square to Jupiter, which is just beyond the cusp of the 4th house, there was a lot of focus on death. Now, Max Heindel tells us very clearly in astrology books, you never talk illness or you never talk death with a person who has a strong Taurus influence. The reason being is that they're so attached to the material world that there's a fear of losing the material world. And this is indeed what Sigmund Freud had. He had a fear for death. So he was drawn to things that were of the occult or of the other worlds, but he was fearful. Now, why this works out is really fascinating astrologically. If we look at the Moon and Saturn in the house of death, they're both in Gemini. And Gemini is the sign that rules the lungs and the breathing mechanism. And on two different occasions in life, when the subject of psychic phenomena and death were brought up and it got too much for him, he started breathing funny and he lost consciousness. He passed out in both cases in fear. So here we find somebody that has amazing insight, probably as much insight as Colette had into the personal subconscious, but he understands it in a way that he can try to heal. Colette described and showed it how it worked out in relationships, but Sigmund Freud used it to heal the problems that were in the subconscious. Now I'm going to put up one more horoscope, and before I do, I just want to say that we're not talking about the most important things in this next horoscope. We're talking only about one very little thing, because it's a perfect example of a positive use of something in the fourth house in a way that most people would never believe. We're not going to talk about the brilliance of this person. We're not going to talk about the philosophy of this person. We're going to talk only about one little thing, because I don't want to have happen what happened yesterday, where we get into all sorts of side things rather than the main topic. This is the horoscope of Rudolf Steiner.
God bless.
I agree. I don't want this to break into a partisan Steiner-Heindel debate. I am,
God bless them both.
yes, I'm very dedicated to the path that was started by Max Heindel. But I believe that both Max Heindel and Rudolf Steiner were very great human beings. They were both high-minded. And what I find is that followers who define themselves as followers often quibble over things like this. We know the classic case when two little boys get in a fight with each other and there are words between them, and one will say to the other, "My dad can beat up your dad." And doesn't that sound awfully a lot like, well, Rudolf Steiner says things that Max Heindel doesn't. No, Max Heindel says things that Rudolf Steiner doesn't. I don't want to get into that stuff. That's just not healthy, and it's not positive evolutionally.
You know, PJ has an original copy of the Cosmos.
Yes, I have too.
Signed to Rudolf Steiner with love and thankfulness.
Yes, I have a copy of that also. To do this kind of thing is against all Rosicrucian principles. We're never supposed to criticize the religion of another or any other religious leaders. All right, we're looking at only very, very little thing in this life, because it shows, I wanted to show a positive way that something was dealt with. Rudolf Steiner was a clairvoyant. There's no doubt about that. And he was very likely an initiate, but only another initiate can say whether one person was an initiate or not. Now, there are various kinds of clairvoyance. There's voluntary and involuntary. And especially among the involuntary clairvoyants, there are many different kinds of involuntary clairvoyance. You know, the ways that things can be stimulated. Some of them, if it's a controlled clairvoyance, if there's a subset of voluntary controlled clairvoyance, it depends on some area that a person is specialized in. Like, for example, Mozart is a specialist as a positive clairvoyant. He didn't know anything about the desire world. In fact, in his desire nature, he was like a child. He was very childish emotionally, but in his mind, he had what Max Heindel calls thought clairvoyance, where you hear the truth. And he could hear an entire symphony in a fraction of a second. He was obviously hearing the singing archetypes in the concrete subdivision of the world of thought. So he was developed in that way, but that's not a general clairvoyance. So usually if there's a positive clairvoyance that is specialized, it's not a general. Now, among involuntary clairvoyants, there are all kinds of involuntary clairvoyance. We've talked about some people being involuntarily clairvoyant and hypersensitive because they haven't evolved into matter yet. And they aren't in touch with this world, and they don't want to be in touch with this world. And usually that kind of involuntary clairvoyance is tainted with a fear of incarnation or a fear of passing into illusion. And then there's a hereditary clairvoyance. And that's what we want to talk about. There's no doubt that Rudolf Steiner was a controlled, voluntary clairvoyant. But with the sun in the fourth house, there was also a hereditary component to it. The kind of clairvoyance that Scotch Highlanders have, or gypsies, or where there's a lot of intermarrying and that sort of thing. I had a girlfriend once who was a gypsy, and she had not fully clairvoyance, but I don't want to talk about it. Rudolf Steiner had vestiges of hereditary clairvoyance, and he knew that would hinder his development of a complete positive controlled clairvoyance. Now, we talked yesterday about people who are naturals, who have inherited tendencies. We talked about Seth Curry, the basketball player whose father was a specialist in three-point shots, and now he's the greatest three-point shooter in the world, the son is, and that's sort of a natural thing. He had to practice and work to develop it, but that came naturally. But obviously, you don't want to have something involuntary or something that's not in your control if you're trying to become a positive clairvoyance. Now, Rudolf Steiner did something that few people can do. He had the sun sextile to Mars and Pluto, almost exactly sextile to Pluto. This means that he had an enormously strong will at his disposal. He could do things that other people could not do. And he didn't show any feats of magic or things like that because he didn't, he was modest. You don't do that. What you do is you share the truth. And this is one of the best applications, though it's a weird application of Christian mysticism that I have ever seen. He was aware of the teaching of Christian mysticism that alcohol wipes out involuntary hereditary clairvoyance. This is why perhaps some people, like Native Americans, are attracted to alcohol, because they need to wipe out that involuntary clairvoyance so that they can move forward in their evolution. Steiner never drank, except when he realized that he needed to wipe out the involuntary clairvoyance. For a period of about a month, he drank, and he drank to intoxication. And when he was sure that the hereditary clairvoyance was wiped out, he never drank again. Now, this is an example of things that you could, he applied the will to both do something that he wouldn't normally do, but he did it to knock out something that was there. He was freeing himself from matter. He was freeing himself from hereditary conditions. On the other hand, he had demands with the planets in the 10th house. He had demands to be in the world. And the sun is opposite Saturn, so that he was uncomfortable being in the world. This is not a Donald Trump who, likes to be out there big and bold. This is somebody that was shy and uncomfortable. He did what he had to do, but he was uncomfortable. And that discomfort drove him into his personal subconscious. There's a square to Uranus, but that's irrelevant to what we're talking about right now. And So what he did is, I don't know if he ever completely overcame this one. And Max Heindel said he never overcame a lot of things in his life. Even late in life, he talks about things bothering him. And that is personal subjectivity. When you are the very consciousness that makes you aware in the personal unconscious is the same kind of consciousness that makes you have a subjective point of view. And this was something hard for him to overcome. For example, he spoke in the most difficult and the most obscure kind of German that you can get. And, he wasn't trying to make it the plainest, simple kind of statement. And if you read Steiner, you have to be your own person. Because everything that Steiner did was he was carrying you by his force of will through his experience of the spiritual worlds. He even said that this is what I do. I describe the inner worlds as they appear to me, or as I work through them. So this is subjectivity. Now, it's all right to use subjectivity, but what happens is subjectivity leads to clannishness. And a lot of people who get involved with Rudolf Steiner's movement have the same kind of clannishness that the folk singers have, like we're this in-group. And it's all right. It's fine to use the subjective method, but you have to be your own person and not be carried along by that. All right. That's all we'll look at for horoscopes today, but we're not done. The fourth house. Let me get to start this off. If we talk about the geography of a human being, the fourth house might be likened to a swamp. It's the low part where things by gravity sink down. If that is true, then the 12th house, which we're now going to begin speaking about and be looking at a lot of horoscopes tomorrow, the 12th house is more like a cave at the top of the mountain. I just saw a cartoon this morning. I look at the funnies every morning. And there's this guy has climbed, it's Broomhilda. She's at the top of the mountain with the guru in front of his cave at the top of the mountain, and the guru is dressed like an Italian gangster. And Broomhilda says, "That's not the kind of wise guy I was expecting." So we're talking not about the high place of aspiration. The high place of aspiration is like the 9th house. We're not talking about the height of worldly attainment. We're talking about the height of unconsciousness. And that's what the 12th house is all about. So we're speaking about opportunities to be in touch with the superconsciousness. We're again speaking of something that's very different from this world and the consciousness we have in this world. We're talking about something that's spiritual and something that's far less material. Now, one of the chief qualities of spiritual things is unity. And in unity, things flow into each other. It is only when we are in the solids of the chemical subdivision of the physical world that there are discrete distinctions. That this begins here and this ends here. In the unity of the spiritual worlds, it's not always that easy. One thing flows into another, and it's hard to grasp a hold of something. For instance, Carl Jung tried to concretize the 12th house by calling it the collective unconscious, not in an astrological sense, but in his life work. Now, for us now, it is unconscious, but it is a reality. And in that reality, it is anything but unconscious. It is more like superconscious. And there are a lot of psychologists, usually those who came after Jung, that talk about a superconsciousness. So what we're going to be talking about now are opportunities to enter into superconscious experience. To put it poetically and mystically, we're going to try to cross the rainbow bridge and enter the kingdom of the gods. Because the 12th house is the doorway to the kingdom of the gods. We're not going to talk specifically about leaving the body because that's a different house, and we'll talk about that toward the end of the week. Some people have visions and clairvoyant experiences, and that's like looking through a window into the kingdom of the gods. We're going to talk quite a bit about that. For most people, in order to come to a positive, controlled, superconscious experience, it takes many lives of control and preparation. I can remember an instance in my case where I was about to enter into a venture which was not beneficial to my evolution, but I got on one of those things, you want to do this, and when you put those two words together, as Krishnamurti says, they're the two of the most dangerous words, I want, and I wanted to do this. And I was about to embark on it, and this still small voice inside of me cried out, but I've worked lives for this. And that's what we're going to talk about, because the 12th house is derivative from the 12th sign, and the 12th sign tries to be the collection of all the signs that came before it. So the 12th house is ripe destiny for many, many past lives. And it's also the key to getting into the worlds of the gods and being successful is humility. Because if you don't have humility and you enter the inner worlds, well, you're just going to be battled to pieces very quickly. So some people have to deal with pride and egoism, things like that, and those people have it crushed out of them. And in that case, the 12th house is like Pisces, and Pisces is, Venus is exalted in Pisces. And if you want an image for what Venus in Pisces is like, it's like the old statement that a rose never smells as sweet as when it is crushed. And we're talking about the crushing of the rose if we make that necessary as a means to enter the kingdom of the gods. Our one brief glimpse into the spiritual worlds, if we have any sanity about us at all, automatically humbles us. Being humiliated can humble us, but it can't humble us in the same way as if we stand before the gods or if we stand before greatness. It's such a thing that we're automatically humbled because we see where we are. We see we're more at the bottom of Jacob's ladder than near the top of it. So in the next session, we're going to look at some hopefully helpful horoscopes about the 12th house and some that are not so helpful. Since there are not many saints that can hobnob with the angels and the gods, it's very hard to find good 12th house examples, but we'll find a few of them. For now, let's close with the Rosicrucian student's prayer. O God, increase our love for Thee, so that we may serve Thee better from day to day. Let the words of our mouths and the meditation of our hearts be acceptable in Thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Well, thank you very much. We got a healthy time for lunch now.
I wanted to say something about my experience with Rudolf Steiner's teachings. And I started in 72 and completely left my world living on Park Avenue behind to study at his main center in the United States, which was
Spring Valley,
35 miles north of New York City. And what I studied there was eurythmy. And eurythmy is dedicated to teach you what will is. And after 4 or 5 years doing it 5 days a week, you learn something very special. Through music, through poetry, time and space. And that was a big contribution from Rudolf Steiner.
Okay.
I have a question about the definition of transference. I think that there's two definitions. I understand transference to be with a male psychiatrist and a female patient, or a female psychiatrist and a male, is a transference of the nature of healing of which Sigmund Freud is famous. The patient becomes attracted sexually to the therapist for the purpose of healing. And the therapist is supposed to be trained not to sleep with their patients.
Yes, that's one of the dangers of transference, but it isn't only...
You didn't mention that.
No, I can't say a whole lot. You know, I'm going to spend the next 3 years talking about Freud and Jung, and transference is going to be a big part of it. Yes, I try to keep it gentle. When I talked about you seeing them as an angel or as a devil, sometimes the devil takes on a very provocative
I've
nature.
had years of psychotherapy, and I've had 3 main psychiatrists, not psychologists, and all of them did the transference, and all of them refrained from any sexual advances.
Yes.
Except the last one I had trouble with.
Yeah, you lose your license these days if you...
Not necessarily.
Can you use the word subconscious and unconscious interchangeably?
Unconscious is the more general term, but the personal unconscious is often called the subconscious. You know, even the superconscious to us is unconscious. I'm going to turn the cooler on.